Three Rivers, Two Mysteries. That's the name of a new investigative series looking at the unsolved deaths of two young men in Pittsburgh. They went missing on two separate nights, but the circumstances surrounding their deaths were eerily similar, causing some to think that there may be a serial killer to blame. Starting tomorrow, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette will launch a podcast called Three Rivers, Two Mysteries to examine the cases. Additional chapters of the podcast will be presented on succeeding days through Tuesdays through November 21st. Joining us now are the co-creators of the podcast, Mike Fuoco, veteran staff writer for the Post-Gazette, and Ashley Murray, a graduate student at Point Park University's Center for Media Innovation. Thank you both for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
So I remember after Dakota's disappearance, I remember these kind of theories starting to circulate. So can you walk us through exactly what happened with both of these cases and how the theories kind of evolved?
Well, the first case was Paul Kochu. He went missing in December 2014. His body was found 3 months later in the Ohio River. Dakota James went missing in January of this year. 3 months later, his body was found in the Ohio River. How they got into the river, was it an accident, was it a suicide, was it a homicide, is unknown. And I was intrigued by that, and also by the similarity in their lives and their cases. Both were young men, both had connections to Duquesne University, both were athletic, both were popular, both were academically gifted. They both had been out drinking with friends and got separated from them and ended up in a body of water and drowned mysteriously. And so
I guess I don't even know if you can reveal this yet, but my big question is anything kind of revealed in the investigation into their two deaths? I mean, that's something that I would want to know at the end of all of this. Is there an answer?
Well, the focus is really on what the families are left with.
Right.
The families are left with a bunch of unanswered questions and with a really traumatic life experience that have changed their family dynamics forever. And so the podcast, you know, the medium itself allows you to really hear the emotion in their voice when they're talking to us, to hear the sadness in their voice, to hear the happiness when they're remembering the boys when they're little.
Right.
And that is what's revealed throughout the podcast, how the families have evolved and how Pittsburgh has dealt with these tragedies.
I remember with both families, they were very vocal through the investigations and the searches for their sons. With Dakota's family in particular, I remember at one point they were really calling for more surveillance cameras through the downtown area. That was one of the biggest things. There was a last point he was seen and then nothing to where his home is, which is not very far. So there should have been something, and they could find no evidence of what happened.
That's correct. And, you know, going forward, they've created a foundation in Dakota's name. They'd like to raise money to fund more surveillance cameras. Had there been more, the last sighting of Dakota was in Katz Plaza. We don't know what happened to him after that. The last sighting of Paul was in front of the Giant Eagle on the south side. We don't know what happened to him after that.
So what about this theory of a serial killer? I mean, it sounds like the podcast is really more of the storytelling of the families, but this theory of the smiley face serial killer, who is that? What is this theory?
Well, I just want to point out that the podcast works on a couple levels. One thing we do is we shine a light on all the questions and the mystery, in addition to showing the families. The smiley face killer is a theory that contends that over the last 2 decades, 100 white male young men, all drinking with friends, go missing and end up dead in a body of water. And Dakota and Paul fit that description. And we talked to the originators of that theory, as one of the many people who are in the podcast.
And we're talking about 100 men from, not just from Pittsburgh, from across the country.
From Boston to Minnesota.
Okay, okay. What was it like working on this? And I mean, I know where you got the idea for it, but what made you think this could be a podcast? This is something people are interested in hearing more about.
I think that that's That's an easy question to answer because of the emotion that's involved in this. And being able to hear how the family say something, to hear how they're speaking, you know, if they're having difficulty getting the words out, if they're having a joyful emotion with some memories that they have. This is really, you know, radio and podcasting is a very intimate medium. You know, you're listening, you know, individually, and I think that that's why this format, you know, makes sense.
How cooperative were the families? I mean, it sounds like you have some very emotional sound from both of them. Were they easy to kind of get on board with the idea of doing this?
Well, initially I started this as a print story, and 3 months into it, it dawned on me that this would make a wonderful, an interesting, fascinating narrative for a podcast. So I initially had gained their trust to talk to me for this print story. I had to go back and explain to them that we now wanted to use audio in telling their story. And they could not have been more cooperative.
And as we're getting ready for the podcast, for people to listen to this, I wanted to ask how do the families feel about what happened to their sons? Do they have any theories? Do they think that there was a serial killer involved? Do they think something like that happened? They
both feel unquestionably that their sons were murdered. Wow. One of them does feel that it could have been a serial murderer.
Wow. Okay, very interesting stuff. Thank you both for sharing a little bit about it. And you can learn more when the new Post-Gazette podcast series called 3 Rivers, 2 Mysteries launches tomorrow. Additional chapters of the podcast, as we mentioned, will be presented on succeeding Tuesdays through November 21st. Very interesting.